There are pages in human history that are uncomfortable to talk about, but impossible to remain silent about. These are pages written with blood and suffering, pages that tell of the very first wars and murders. We are accustomed to thinking that war is the lot of civilization, that savages lived in harmony with nature and with each other. However, archaeology and anthropology prove the opposite. Evidence of violence is found in the most ancient layers, suggesting that the struggle for existence was not only with wild animals, but also with their own kind. The discoveries of recent decades have completely changed our understanding of primitive society. We are used to the image of Cro-Magnon man as a noble hunter living in harmony with nature. But this image is far from the truth. Hunting humans was sometimes more profitable than hunting animals. Watch the video to the end to find out how and why people began to hunt each other. One of the earliest and most frightening finds indicating violence between humans is a skeleton from the Wooden Hills cave in Slovenia, dated to be about 100,000 years old. This skeleton, believed to belong to a Neanderthal, showed signs of having been struck with a club. This could not have been an accident. It was a deliberate and deadly act. Another equally important discovery was made in a European cave, where the bones of several people were found with marks from stone tools, indicating a brutal massacre. These marks are not similar to damage caused by animals. They were made by humans using stone knives. These findings suggest that killings among humans were not isolated incidents, but part of their lives. In some caves located in different parts of the world, archaeologists have found skeletons with clear signs of fatal injuries inflicted with tools. For example, skulls with holes were found in the Shandong and Morgan caves, which according to scientists were made deliberately, and in the Haojing cave, a skull with a deep fracture was found, probably caused by a powerful blow with a spear. These findings, dating back tens of thousands of years, allow us to assume that violence was not uncommon. It was part of the life of primitive man. The findings in the Haojing cave are particularly intriguing. The bones of several dozen people were found scattered throughout the cave. Some of these bones had spearheads stuck in them. This was not just murder, it was a battle. This suggests that even then, people were capable of organized clashes. In light of these facts, we can only guess what our distant ancestors might have been fighting for. Perhaps it was not only a struggle for resources, but something else. For example, influence, territory, or even ritual objects. Influence could secure a stronger position in social groups, and territory could provide access to strategically important places. Ritual objects could be associated with beliefs and symbols that gave strength. Maybe they were fighting not for resources, but for something much more unexpected? Write your guesses in the comments about what primitive people might have actually been fighting for. The motives for murder in primitive society could have been very different. The main reason, of course, was the struggle for resources. Land with fertile soil, water, hunting grounds. All of this was vital for survival. If one group of people occupied a territory rich in resources, another group could try to take it by force. In addition, the seizure of valuable tools could be a cause of conflict. Spears and knives made of flint and obsidian were very valuable. They took a long time to make, and their loss could be fatal for the whole group. Seizing them could provide an advantage. Another reason could be disagreements between tribes. For example, if one tribe violated the border of another tribe, it could lead to conflict. When primitive tribes clashed, they could not always find common ground. An important motive for murder could have been the capture of women. In small groups of several dozen people, there might not have been enough women. This could have led to clashes between groups. Captured women could have become a source of new connections and increased genetic diversity, which was important for survival. Finally, we can assume that sometimes the killings were motivated by personal reasons. Jealousy, revenge, personal grudges, all of these, as we know, can cause conflict. And although we have no direct evidence of such motives, we can assume that they existed. However, in addition to these reasons, killing a fellow tribesman had other advantages. First, it was much less risky than hunting large and dangerous animals such as mammoths or cave bears. Second, it not only provided valuable resources, but also eliminated a competitor who could fight for the same resources in the future. Eliminating a competitor from another group could be a more important task than obtaining meat from hunting an animal. But why was killing a fellow human more effective and faster than killing an animal? Watch the video to the end to find out the answer to this question. As primitive communities developed, methods of violence also changed. While simple clubs and knives were used in the early stages, with the advent of more sophisticated tools, such as spears, killings became more organized and effective. For example, in the ice cave in southern Siberia, the remains of a settlement were found where skeletons dating back approximately 30,000 years were discovered. One of the skeletons belonged to a man whose bones had a spearhead made of hard obsidian stuck in them. Obsidian is not found in this region, which suggests that this spear was brought from another place and probably belonged to a foreign tribe. This indicates that conflicts began to occur between groups living at a distance from each other. Another example is the Stone Grotto Cave in Germany, where the skeletons of several people were found with arrow marks on them. The arrows found near the skeletons were made of wood and had obsidian tips. These finds date back approximately 20,000 years, suggesting that bows and arrows were already in use at that time. It was a very formidable weapon that allowed strikes to be made from a distance. It allowed killings to be carried out without coming into direct contact with the victim. As weapons evolved, so did the tactics of warfare. Whereas previously there had been spontaneous clashes, over time these became increasingly organized. Groups of people could prepare for an attack, track down their enemies, and launch a surprise assault. For example, in the Sunny Grotto Cave in France, the remains of a settlement were found where the skeletons of several people were discovered. The skeletons were found in one place, which suggests that the people were killed at the same time. The skeletons showed signs of multiple blows. This was probably an attack that resulted in the destruction of the group. Over time, violence became not just a spontaneous reaction, but a deliberate strategy. Primitive but effective tactics of attack and defense emerged. For example, ambushes in narrow cave passages or near water bodies allowed a small detachment to gain an advantage over a larger enemy. In some caves, such as Red Rock in China, archaeologists have found traces of temporary fortifications, stone barriers that probably served to protect against hostile groups. In addition, violence began to take on a ritualistic character. Killing an enemy could be part of an initiation rite or a way to prove one's strength and right to leadership. For example, skulls with polished surfaces were found in the Quiet Forest Cave in Siberia, which could indicate that they were used as trophies or ritual objects. All this suggests that violence was an integral part of primitive man's life. It was the driving force behind evolution, forcing people to invent new tools and develop new survival tactics. In addition to conflicts between tribes, violence also occurred within communities themselves. In small groups where everyone was visible, conflicts were inevitable. They could be caused by a struggle for power, resources, or simply personal animosity. For example, in the Sunset Lake Cave in Spain, the skeletons of several people were found who, according to scientists, were killed by other members of their own group. One of the skeletons belonged to an elderly man with a spearhead stuck in his skull. Next to him were the skeletons of two young men who had also been killed. This could have been the result of a struggle for power or simply revenge. Another example of social violence is the Northern Grotto Cave in Germany, where the skeletons of two people were found with traces of numerous blows from clubs. These people were probably killed for breaking the rules or simply for being different from everyone else. This suggests that primitive communities had strict rules and that breaking them was punishable. And you thought you had bad neighbors? Violence within groups could also be related to ritual practices or the desire to maintain social order. For example, some tribes had rituals in which one of the group members could be sacrificed to appease the gods or ensure a successful hunt. Such rituals were part of primitive man's life and may not have been perceived by him as cruelty. In the Sun Cave in Germany, human skeletons were found with signs of ritual violence, such as marks from sharp instruments on the bones that could not have been inflicted during a normal fight or conflict. These marks were made with the intent to cause pain, suggesting that violence was part of religious and social rituals. Over time, violence became more complex. It became part of a survival strategy, helping people survive in harsh conditions. It allowed them to obtain resources and defend their territory. But how did people go from simple punishments and rituals to actually hunting each other, where humans became the main prey? We will tell you about this right now. Violence between people had its own logic. It was not just an act of aggression, but a means of survival. Sometimes hunting another human being was more profitable than hunting an animal. First, it was less risky. Animals, especially large ones, were very dangerous and could cause serious injuries. At the same time, humans, even when armed, were more predictable. Second, hunting humans was faster. There was no need to track down prey and wait for the right moment. One simply had to find an opponent and attack them. In addition, killing another human being provided not only meat, but also valuable resources, clothing, tools, and jewelry. Finally, killing another human being was a kind of signal, a warning to other tribes. It showed that this group was strong and best not to mess with. Additional research shows that human prey was also more predictable in terms of behavior and location. Unlike migrating herds of animals, humans often remained in the same area, using the same trails and water sources. This made them much easier to track down. Moreover, knowledge of the social structures and weaknesses of the enemy group allowed for highly effective planning of attacks. For example, attacking a group when its members were busy gathering food or resting was less risky. This was not a primitive act of animal rage, but rather a cold calculation. Violence became a form of economic and social competition, where victory meant not just survival, but domination. Thus, violence was not simply an act of aggression, but part of a survival strategy. It helped people survive in the harsh conditions of the primitive world. Cannibalism is one of the most terrifying chapters in human history. Scientists have found ample evidence that Neanderthals and even ancient Cro-Magnons ate each other. For example, in the Red Rock Cave in Spain, the bones of several Neanderthals were found with marks from stone tools, indicating that their skin had been removed and their flesh cut off. Similar marks were found on animal bones, suggesting that humans treated them in the same way as food. Another example is the Ice Lake Cave in Germany, where the bones of several Cro-Magnons were found, also showing traces of stone tools. These finds date back approximately 20,000 years, suggesting that cannibalism was widespread at that time. But why did people practice cannibalism? One reason could have been hunger. In harsh winter conditions, when there was no other food available, cannibalism could have been the only way to survive. Another reason could have been rituals. Some tribes believed that by eating the flesh of their enemies, they would acquire their strength and wisdom. Cannibalism was also a way to show one's power. Further research shows that cannibalism may have been not only ritualistic, but also a form of signaling. Eating the flesh of an enemy could be a kind of warning to other tribes that it was better not to mess with this group. It demonstrated their strength and ruthlessness, which could be a powerful psychological weapon. In some cases, cannibalism may have been associated with symbolic actions, such as using skulls as bowls or jewelry. Remains found in the Cueva del Silencio cave in Spain, dated to approximately 15,000 years ago, show signs that the skin was removed from the skulls and the bones were polished. These skulls may have been used in rituals or as trophies. In the primitive world, even food was a strategy. But what about war? Let's discuss it right now. As society developed, so did the art of war. People began to use not only force, but also cunning to defeat their enemies. For example, they could use traps to catch their opponents. They could use ambushes to attack suddenly. They could use smoke and fire to cover their tracks. All this suggests that war was not just a battle, but a complex game in which the winner was the one who was smarter and more cunning. Traces of primitive military fortifications have been found in caves. For example, traces of primitive stone walls were found in the Solnecni Bereg cave in Spain, which, according to scientists, were used to protect against attack. These walls were built in such a way that it was difficult to penetrate them. They were built in such a way that it was possible to observe the surrounding areas and defend against attack. Another example is the Stone Shield Cave in Germany, where traces of primitive defensive structures were found. These structures were built in such a way that it was possible to hide from the enemy and launch a surprise attack. All this suggests that war was not just a battle, but a complex game in which the winner was the one who was smarter and more cunning. With the development of social structures and tools, the tactics of warfare became increasingly complex and sophisticated. In some cases, primitive tribes used psychological tricks to intimidate their opponents. For example, loud noises made with hollow tree trunks could create the illusion of a large number of warriors. or the use of bright colors and symbols on their bodies to show their strength and ruthlessness. Evidence of reconnaissance and counterintelligence has also been found in caves. Tribes could send their warriors to spy on enemy groups and find out their numbers, location, and weaknesses. All this suggests that primitive people were not just savages, but thoughtful strategists who used all available means to achieve victory. War was part of their lives, but it was not meaningless. It was a means of survival and domination in a world where everyone was on their own. The psychology of the primitive warrior was probably very complex. On the one hand, they were forced to kill in order to survive. On the other hand, killing another person, even an enemy, was probably a very difficult and psychologically traumatic experience. Scientists suggest that primitive communities had special rituals that helped people cope with psychological pressure. For example, they may have used dance and song to calm themselves and prepare for battle. They may have used magical rituals to protect themselves from evil and attract good luck. They could use rituals to honor the memory of slain enemies and ask for their forgiveness. All this suggests that the primitive warrior was not just a soulless killing machine. He was a human being with feelings and emotions. He was forced to kill in order to survive, but he was not heartless. Recent research in paleopsychology and ethnography allows us to better understand the inner world of the primitive warrior. Scientists suggest that during battle and killing, they produce special hormones that help them overcome fear and pain. However, after the battle, these hormones disappeared and were replaced by stress and depression. To cope with this, primitive people could use various methods, such as hallucinogenic plants or transcendental rituals, which helped them overcome feelings of guilt and fear. In addition, primitive tribes had a cult of heroes and warriors. Young people who performed feats were given special status and respect. This created social pressure and forced them to perform feats even if they did not want to. At the same time, they received support and recognition, which helped them cope with psychological pressure. Thus, the psychology of the primitive warrior was a complex mixture of physiological reactions, social norms, and ritual practices that helped them survive and dominate in a harsh world. Violence in primitive society had its own symbolism. Killing an enemy was not just an act of aggression, but an act of strength and courage. It showed that a person was strong and willing to do anything to protect their group. Cave paintings depicting scenes of murder have been found in some caves. These drawings were probably created to commemorate the heroic deeds of warriors. They were a kind of chronicle telling of great battles and victories. In addition, violence had its own religious symbolism. Some tribes believed that by killing an enemy, they were making a sacrifice to the gods. They believed that the gods would be favorable to them and help them in the future. All this suggests that violence was not just an act of aggression, but part of culture and religion. It was a way of understanding the world and one's place in it. The symbolic meaning of violence can also be traced in artifacts. For example, the skulls of slain enemies could be used as trophies or ritual objects. In the ice cave in Germany, skulls with holes were found, which according to scientists were made on purpose. These skulls could have been used as drinking bowls or as decorations. This suggests that violence had not only practical, but also symbolic significance. Also, in some caves, decorations made from the bones of slain enemies were found. These decorations were probably worn by warriors to show their strength and courage. They were a kind of badge of honor that set them apart from the crowd. All this suggests that violence was not simply an act of aggression, but part of a complex system of social hierarchies and ritual practices that help people survive and dominate in a harsh world. Violence was not just an act of aggression, but a way of understanding the world and one's place in it. The legacy of violence in primitive society is still alive in us today. We still live in a world where war and murder are part of our lives. We still fight for resources, for power, for land. We still use violence to solve our problems. However, there is good news. Unlike our ancestors, we can choose a different path. We can choose peace, cooperation, and mutual assistance. We can use our minds and our knowledge to solve our problems without violence. We can build a world where there is no place for war and murder. We can truly become civilized people, leaving no place for violence in our history. We can learn to live in harmony with one another. Genetic research confirms that the legacy of primitive aggression still exists in our genes. Some of these genes responsible for the production of stress and aggression hormones were vital for survival in harsh conditions. However, in the modern world, these genes can lead to psychological problems and social maladjustment. Understanding this helps us to combat our dark sides. We must remember that evolution does not stop. We can influence it, and that influence begins with ourselves. We can develop empathy, compassion, and mutual aid in ourselves to overcome our primitive instincts. We can build a society based on justice and equality, where there is no place for violence. We can use our knowledge and technology to create a world where every person feels safe. It will not be easy, but we must remember that we have a choice, and that choice is what distinguishes us from our primitive ancestors. We can truly become civilized people, leaving no place for violence in our history. We can learn to live in harmony with one another. The history of humanity, as we see it, is very complex and contradictory. It has room for great discoveries and terrible tragedies. We, as descendants of primitive people, carry their legacy within us, and we can decide what to do with it. We can choose the path of peace and cooperation, or we can choose the path of violence and destruction. Which path will you choose? Leave a comment below this video and write what you think about this. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our new videos. Thank you for watching.